Hey Internet, so the election is over and it's time to give my post-mortem thoughts about it. Just give a little examination of what went down, go over some of the people who were very, very wrong, laugh at some cope, and I'd also like to explain why Kamala Harris lost. And I'll be basing all of this on some actual data, not just my personal feelings about it. So first off, just to get the obvious out of the way, unless you've been living under a rock the last couple of days, Kamala lost. Kamala got pretty much destroyed. She actually performed noticeably worse than I thought she would. If we take a look at Decision Desk HQ, they've now finished up and called it for all 50 states, which means that we now know that Arizona and Nevada have indeed gone to Trump. Which means that Kamala Harris did so badly that she actually lost every single swing state. Pretty embarrassing, actually. So I'll just bring up the final result right here. Donald Trump wins 312 to Kamala Harris's 226. That is the 2024 presidential results. So yeah, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, all went to Trump. And in relation to my own personal prediction, I'm honestly feeling pretty good. I only got one state wrong, that being Michigan, and I admitted during my prediction there that I could be wrong about Michigan. I knew that that one could very well go either way. And I was right, both Michigan and Wisconsin were pretty darn thin. I mean, just look at the numbers here. He won Michigan by 49.8 to Kamala Harris's 48.3. And then he won Wisconsin to 49.8 to Kamala Harris's 48.8. So yeah, I was actually right that those states would be pretty close. On a bad day for Trump, he could have easily lost those. However, another thing that it looks like is that I was wrong about the popular vote. Trump did a little bit better than I thought he would. It's not easy, mainly due to the People's Democratic Republic of California, for anybody who is not a Democrat to win the popular vote, since California usually ends up just kind of stacking millions upon millions of extra votes on top of whoever the Democratic Party nominee is. That's just how California elections work, nothing suspicious about it. And California will still likely continue to give Kamala Harris a bunch of extra votes, because they haven't actually finished counting in the state, no surprise there. Again, that's just how California is, nothing suspicious about it. But overall, Trump will very, very, very likely continue to have the popular vote. Again, I figured that Trump would win, but this is pretty much as good of a victory as he could get. Maybe on an even better day, it could have been even more ridiculous in his favor. For instance, on a really, really good day, he could have possibly picked up Minnesota, Virginia, and New Hampshire, but those would all be really big long shots. As far as any mistakes I made, I think the main issue is I didn't give Atlas enough credit. My methodology for how I figured the election would go was I weighted it based a little bit on poll accuracy. So in other words, I weighted pollsters who I knew wouldn't necessarily be that honest a little bit less than usual. That's why I was a little bit closer to being correct than the RCP average. Atlas Intel's methodology is pretty good, and they correctly seem to have called the whole thing. However, one thing I was absolutely right in was weighting things against CNN's polls. CNN had Harris at +6, where everybody else had her at +1 or at most +2. As I said back then before the election, it's very, very, very unlikely for CNN to be correct on this, and Atlas, Insider, Emerson, and everybody else to be wrong, which is the reasoning I used to toss their poll out, and which is why I gave Wisconsin to Trump. And that's just kind of the problem with a lot of pollsters. A lot of the pollsters, especially the ones tied to mainstream media, tend to lean a bit more towards propaganda than being honest. And now, of course, since the election has passed, we know for a fact that my reasoning was correct on that. Very pathetic on the part of CNN, shame on them, just obvious, outrageous lies. And that's an important thing to take away from this election, aside from just who won and what led up to people winning and all the various politics behind it. It's important to remember the polls and who was right and who was wrong. Some pollsters are honest and have good methodology, some pollsters are honest but have bad methodology, and other pollsters are just pretty much flat out making stuff up. They're just weighting things towards their preferred party, and they do it because they want to make it seem like their preferred side is winning, because an interesting thing a lot of people don't know is that there's roughly 5 to 10% of the voter base that votes entirely based on what they think will win. So there's a lot of very irrational voters out there who will vote for the candidate who they think will win so that they can feel like they have the correct thoughts in their head. They want to vote for the winning team simply because they want to feel like they won. And pollsters know this, and propagandists know this, and that's why you see so many dishonest polls. There is, sadly, unironically, a mindless sheep vote. There is, in fact, a mindless sheep voter bloc who wants to vote purely based on conformity and has no care about policy whatsoever, which is equal parts sad and equal parts completely hilarious. And another thing to look at is the predictions made by various political commentators, because there were some very, very delusional takes out there. For instance, there was this fringe poll from Des Moines Register that Harris would win Iowa by +3. No, definitely not. That was almost just certainly last-minute propaganda to, again, get the sheep vote. But anyway, enough about that. A more entertaining thing to look at is that in the last half of this week, we have, of course, been seeing some cope. Yep, that is right. The salt mines are open. And a lot of the salt out there mainly reflects how many people kind of fell for some DNC propaganda. And I'll first like to start this out with this nice cope clip from Destiny as the results were coming in.
Train, you know the animes where it looks like the guy's like losing and he's got like 7 forms and you haven't even seen form 1 yet? That's what Kamala's like. She's like base level Frieza fighting. Dragon Ball Z. Yeah, she's base level Frieza right now fighting Krillin, okay? And they're like, oh, I think we're gonna win this, Gohan. And it's like, yeah, no.
They did win it though. They killed Frieza.
Shut the... Are you serious? You're actually so cringe.
Kelly, get out.
Ignore that.
Leave. God,
I hate it when guys...
Yeah, that one just pretty much speaks for itself. But let's also go over a bit of the abortion cope. I kind of mentioned this when I went over Donald Trump and Kamala Harris's policy proposals on the topic of abortion. Neither Trump or Kamala actually differ that significantly on abortion. Trump has no interest in a national abortion ban and will just keep the status quo of moving it to the states. And because that decision was made by the higher courts, the Supreme Court, Kamala Harris wouldn't really be able to do anything about it either. And the way she worded her promises on abortion in her policy proposals kind of showed that she knew she wouldn't actually be able to do anything. So no matter who actually won this election, the decision to allow abortion or not would almost certainly still be relegated to the states. If you have an opinion on abortion rights that you want to be heard, you have to vote in the lower level, state level elections for it. Whether it's Trump or Kamala in the White House doesn't matter because that is a decision that has been removed from federal control. And yet, of course, if you saw all of the ads for Kamala Harris's campaign and the DNC's campaign, you noticed that they were running overwhelmingly on abortion, which is, of course, completely ridiculous because it didn't actually matter who was the president for abortion. It's just that the DNC has done a very good job with this propaganda campaign, convincing a lot of women into thinking that their entire personhood and their entire rights that matter entirely depend on whether or not they can have an abortion. And so they've played this very good fear-mongering card on women, making them think that they're going to be literally turned into a handmaiden's tale or something if Donald Trump were to win the election, which is extremely unlikely to happen. But of course it doesn't matter because propaganda doesn't care about fact. It just cares about scaring people into the voting booth in order to vote a certain way, regardless of the facts. And so of course there's a lot of women on TikTok crying and whining because they think that all of their rights are going to be taken away because Trump is in office. And it's of course kind of ridiculous because it's not actually true. Don't worry ladies, your rights are not really going to be taken away just because Donald Trump is in office. That's just not going to be a thing. And as funny as it is, it kind of also shows the negative consequences of propaganda when things don't go the propagandist's way. Because these women are genuinely terrified. Kind of funny to see, but they are genuinely terrified. They unironically believe that Trump is some kind of neo-Nazi fascist that is going to end democracy and dress women up in that funny Handmaiden's Tale suit. And that psychological damage that they are currently feeling is really the fault of the DNC for doubling down so hard on that propaganda campaign. And then of course there's some Reddit cope, which largely reflects that propaganda. Like this one right here, disappointed Harris voters conclude America hates women. I mean, yeah, if your entire understanding of the election was centered around Kamala Harris's ad campaigns, and you knew nothing else, and never bothered to use any reasoning to figure out if there was anything else, that is exactly the kind of low IQ conclusion one might come to. Or here's some really big quote from The Guardian. Our mistake was to think we lived in a better country than we do. I mean, just wow. Imagine actually thinking that the economic direction that the United States is heading is anywhere near sustainable. This is actually a common midwit mistake. People confuse functional for sustainable. United States, if we keep going in the direction we're going in regards to finances, we're eventually going to run into some very big problems in regards to the Federal Reserve and Social Security. The sort of midwit bureaucracy run by a bunch of managerial elites that currently runs the United States government is not something that can actually go on for very much longer. If we don't dismantle it, we're going to be very, very lucky if it can last longer than 30 years. Just because it currently seems to be functioning within liberal democracy doesn't mean it can function forever. But of course, that's not the reason that The Guardian has, and that's not the reason that these Reddit copers have. They, of course, think that it's entirely because Orange Man has been re-elected. Just complete and total lack of understanding. Our country bad because Orange Man bad and Orange Man elected. That's the problem with people who live in echo chambers. They just have no idea what's wrong with the country. They have no idea what's wrong with the world. Everything that they do know is limited by an extremely narrow view presented to them by mass media. It's honestly pretty darn pathetic. But of course, Reddit politics is just an echo chamber that's limited by whatever the mainstream media has to say. There's a lot more cope elsewhere. And honestly, you can easily just search for tons of videos on cringe compilations and salt compilations. There's already a few good ones out there, which you can check if you want to laugh at that stuff. What I'd really like to end this on is why Kamala lost. Why could Harris not pull it off? And there's quite a few reasons why. The reality is Kamala Harris had a really big leg up, which is that she got to be the Democratic nominee despite not ever actually winning any kind of Democratic nominee process. She lost very badly in her attempt to be the Democratic Party nominee back in 2020 and was only selected purely based on being a woman of color, which again, that's not just my personal suspicion, that is the objective truth. Biden said he would pick a woman, and then the Democratic Party doubled down and said it should be a woman of color. And so they had Amy Klobuchar step back, and then they had Kamala Harris step in for Biden's VP pick. And then, of course, she was the Democratic nominee for 2024, despite not actually winning the nomination. And that just kind of left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. There's definitely a lot of people who voted for her anyway, but not very many. I talked with a lot of liberals here in Portland, Oregon who were upset about this fact. There's plenty of news political commentators who were upset about this fact. So there was likely enough people who were upset about this to the point where it actually did hurt her numbers a bit. Another reason that Kamala Harris lost is likely just because of the difference between the mass media and sort of the new internet media. Things like Joe Rogan podcasts versus MSNBC talking heads. One nice white pill is that there is some pretty good data to suggest that more and more people are waking up to the fact that mainstream corporate media is just flat out not to be trusted. Every single one of them has a very major revolving door relationship with the state, and every single one of them has regurgitated state propaganda, and most of what they say is pretty demonstrably nonsensical. And so the fact that the entire mass media was singing her praises just doesn't really mean much anymore. For example, if you look at this graph right here, you can see that Americans' trust in mass media has significantly fallen over the years. Democrats, of course, trust them a lot more than Republicans do, but in both cases, there's actually been a downward trend in the last 3 years. And of course, if we were to add Mises Caucus libertarians like myself to this graph, we would all be just kind of sitting down there at zero. Because of course, we've known that the mass media has been a propaganda racket for a very long time. The point is, having them on your side just isn't enough of a boon anymore. Too many people know that it's propaganda. Every single major corporate cable TV channel as well just has too many incentives to be dishonest. Their funding is just way too tied to the state and way too tied to various special interest groups. And as a result of that, if anything, being endorsed by modern corporate journoids is actually kind of a downside. The journos have lost so much credibility that it's almost entirely rational to just assume that whatever the opposite of their opinion is true. And that's what this election is kind of a reputation of. Kamala Harris had journoids working in her favor round the clock, publishing opinion article after opinion article after opinion article, singing her praises. And for what? Nothing. Absolutely nothing at all. Another problem she faced was the Israel and Palestine conflict, which, again, happened on her and Biden's watch. Not exactly something she can blame Trump for, and it's something that very heavily demoralized a lot of the younger leftist voters. There was also the issue that people kind of started to notice towards the end of the last month of this election, which is that the whole campaign she and Waltz took on as one of their talking points of calling J.D. Vance and Trump weirdos turned out to largely just be projection. Vance appeared on Joe Rogan and was perfectly capable of holding a normal conversation in an uncontrolled setting, with unpredictable questions, whereas Harris and Waltz were completely unable to do so. And that's, well, pretty weird. If you can't have a conversation if it's not within your little elitist echo chamber, that's a pretty big red flag. Another problem is that her policies were just bad. Again, I did a video going over all of her policy decisions, and again, they were worse than I expected them to be, with her fiscal policy especially just being completely ridiculous. And then everything else about her was just status quo establishment, mainly showing that she's just another representative of the mid-witted elites, the bureaucratic managerial class that is currently in control of both our state and intellectual institutions. So how exactly were we to trust that Kamala Harris would fix any of these problems if she represents the people who are causing those problems? Especially when she didn't show any evidence whatsoever that she understood that that's where the problems were coming from. Which then brings me to DEI and wokeness, along with the radical postmodernist ideology that tends to support it. And again, something that is largely favored by the bureaucratic managerial class. And fortunately, it seems a lot of people are realizing that this is nonsense and not buying it anymore. Leftist identity politics especially have completely failed to resolve racial relations. And why wouldn't they fail? Of course they're going to fail. It's an attempt to fix a problem caused by collectivism with collective guilt. That's never going to work. DEI is a self-contradiction. Collectivist equity-based policies create discrimination against people on an individual level, thus creating the very problem that they are proposed to be fixing, because individuals are real and collectives are really just social constructs. Something that the far left has completely screwed up on because they get it entirely backwards. They thought they could treat the individual as a social construct and the collective as a literally real thing, despite the fact that only the individual can be isolated from this equation. And so of course, wokeness has failed. I don't think Americans fully understand why it has failed, and I think a lot of Americans still don't really understand what wokeness really is. But a lot of people are, for the most part, catching on to the fact that it doesn't work. And Kamala Harris was just an obvious face of DEI, because again, she was only picked for her position based on DEI standards. And people didn't like that. I know left-leaning people here in Portland, Oregon, who are obviously not highly progressive SJW-style leftists, but still people with some progressive ideas, who were upset over the fact that Kamala Harris was effectively just a DEI pick. Another problem I have to point out was that the third-party candidates this election cycle weren't that great. And it's kind of sad to point this out myself because I am a Mises Caucus libertarian, and unfortunately Chase Oliver just wasn't the guy. He represents the kind of progressive libertarianism that overemphasizes open borders, that just doesn't really get any kind of traction. So hopefully us libertarians can pick a better candidate next time. Someone who actually understands some strategy, and also someone who is preferably not just someone who's basically a Democrat, but with an actual understanding of economics. So very few people voted libertarian this year. I'm guessing a good amount of those votes probably ended up going to Trump. And then of course there's just the fact that Joe Biden did not do a very good job. Just about all the data I've seen that suggests that Biden did a good job is done by fudging the numbers to not account for the COVID hump. So they give Biden credit for things that happened once the lockdowns ended, such as jobs returning to the economy because there was no longer lockdown, and so they say things like Biden created the most jobs in the economy ever, which is of course a completely ridiculous thing to say. The reality is when you accounted for COVID and properly controlled for it, Biden caused more inflation than Trump. And on that note, it's important to point out that Biden's strategy for dealing with COVID was really not that much different than Trump's strategy. In 2020, Trump's strategy was largely interventionism, and then when Biden won, his strategy was more interventionism. In fact, Biden's was a much worse strategy than Trump, because in the case of Trump at least gave everybody a little money, regardless of what they were doing. It was basically UBI. Now, that's not good, because it's still a plug being plugged into itself, but it's a lot better than what Biden did, such as, paying people more money to not work than they were being paid to work, which is basically the government investing against there being a supply of goods and services, which is of course completely insane. Obviously that would cause inflation. You can't just use the Fed money printer go brr and then use that money to pay people to not work, and then of course top it off with an Inflation Reduction Act that did absolutely nothing to reduce inflation and was in fact just more interventionism with just the name Inflation Reduction Act. It was a complete catastrophe, and everybody with even just the most basic understanding of economics saw right through it. And lastly, I just have to point out that people have caught on to the whole stupid fake Hitler scare. A lot of Kamala Harris's campaigning was based entirely on the strategy of painting Orange Man as literally bad mustache man. That's effectively what the Project 2025 fearmongering was. And the problem with it was that any relatively intelligent person could easily verify it as false. The Heritage Foundation made their book free to download, and so anybody with the time to do so could just download it themselves on their own free time, go through it, and quickly find out that the DNC's campaign against it was entirely just nonsensical fearmongering. And while the mainstream media played ball with it, again, that didn't really help her because they're just not that credible anymore. People don't trust them anymore. And so relying on MSNBC and CNN to go along with your fake Hitler scares, it's just not a viable strategy anymore. Calling your opponents and anybody who supports them bigots, racists, sexist, etc., it just doesn't work anymore. It hasn't worked for a while, but it's got to the point where it's such a bad strategy that it actually makes you look dumb for trying to do it. We have gotten to the point where if you see someone in the media accusing somebody else of being a bigot, chances are that person making the accusation is lying to you. And yet Kamala Harris tried to have her campaign run with that strategy anyway. And so the result of this is bad policies built on misinformation, built on a foundation of bad strategy, all propping up a candidate that honestly just isn't very likable, and very obviously dishonest. Like, for example, she tried to distance herself from Biden, claiming she would not be a second Biden term, but then in her policy proposals, she tries to take credit for the things that happened under Biden as if she was a part of it. I mean, you can't have things both ways, Kamala. And then you can't try to cover that up by just calling Orange Man bad, while your media allies call his supporters bigots. It just doesn't work anymore, which is pathetic because it's not like Donald Trump is an unbeatable candidate. All you really have to do is just run a coherent and honest campaign against him. But unfortunately for Kamala Harris, she is neither a coherent or honest person, and so of course she was unable to do so. video. And that's all I have to say on the matter, really. So anyway, that's all. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, you can like, comment, and subscribe. And if you really like it, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, of which there's a new Simplified Taxation is Theft shirt out, which may or may not be a nod to my next high effort video. But yeah, that's all. Till next time.